Hi there, my name is Chris Blazina. I'm a practicing psychologist in the United States, a retired professor, 20 years training students to be psychologists and therapists, and I'm an independent researcher and author. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the pet effect and the parallel with potential outcome psychotherapy research. First, let me talk a little bit about the pet effect. This has been a topic that is controversial in the human-animal interaction area. It basically argues that when a pet becomes an animal companion, that is, they become like a friend or family member, there can be very positive psychological and physical effects. Some of the research that has looked at this has suggested that the pet effect can involve things like a decrease in anxiety, a decrease in loneliness, an increase in social support. These are really important findings that, while not absolutely conclusive, they do point in the direction of trying to understand more about the pet effect and its underpinnings in terms of why this might be. Well, the purpose of my talk today is to try to get at those underpinnings in terms of parallels with what happens in the practice of psychotherapy. It doesn't mean that I'm suggesting that animal companions are trained therapists sitting on their little couches in our lives, but there's the potential for the relationship that we share to be one that is generative and in some cases even potentially healing. I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk a little bit about the history of psychotherapy research in probably 2 minutes, 100 plus years in 2 or 3 minutes. So with the beginning of psychoanalysis and Freud, he really wanted to apply some scientific credibility to his newly founded science. And the way he did this was to report in case study format. He would take one individual that he was working with, talk about the treatment and the potential outcome, and that was to be the scientific basis for, yes, psychotherapy actually works. Now, we know that the case studies are an N of 1, and they are interesting and imply and provide really fascinating information, but they're not in a scientific way absolutely conclusive. Some of the research that happened further along the way in the 1950s and 60s, including a type of controversial interaction between researcher Hans Eysenck and psychotherapist Hans Strupp, among others. And Eysenck's position was that he really doubted that the notion that psychotherapy was actually helpful. In fact, based on one of his studies, he found that 2/3 of patients would spontaneously recover within a year to 2 years. That data was later reanalyzed and found not to be quite accurate. But really, the turning of the tide happened in 1977 with new statistical methods such as meta-analysis, where you're able to take a number of studies, the results of those studies, and analyze them at one time. And Smith, Miller, and Glass did what's now known as a very famous study in terms of meta-analysis and what's called psychotherapy outcome research. The outcome research suggests, okay, is psychotherapy actually effective or not? And what they found was an effect size of about 0.7, and later studies have found from 0.7 to 0.8. And in social science, that's a rather large effect size. And what that suggests in real terms would be that 70 to 80% of people who are in psychotherapy are significantly better than a control of those who have not been in that. That finding has been really consistent, whether it's with adults or children, that 0.7 to 0.8 mark in terms of effect size is really important. So that's the outcome psychotherapy research. Yes, the question's finally been answered. Psychotherapy is helpful. The other part of this type of research includes an outcome and process type of therapy research. So the process would be, if psychotherapy works, how come? What are the factors involved? Now, studies continue to go on, and we're in a social science that's been around for over 100 years, and we're still trying to answer the questions of not that psychotherapy works or not, but how does it work? And the research findings come up again and again that the most significant part in terms of various variables focuses on the relationship between client and therapist. It's not the individual technique or psychotherapy orientation. It's the connection that is built between the client and therapist. Sometimes it's referred to as the working alliance. Well, so if the relationship is really a quintessential aspect of helping people grow or even heal, especially from particularly difficult childhood events, sometimes it's referred to as adverse childhood events or developmental trauma, where really children growing up, they miss out on essential psychological needs, and it really does leave a rather devastating mark. So if the relationship is a key part of psychotherapy, the potential parallel now would be to use this model of, is the relationship with the human and animal companion, is that really what's driving the potential underpinnings of the pet effect? And I'm going to argue today that yes, that is in fact probably what is going on. I can't be absolutely definitive, but I'm going to postulate today that the relationship is key in terms of this pet effect, that connection becomes a generative relationship. It even potentially becomes a healing aspect for some folks. But if I just left it right there in terms of, yes, well, the relationship, for some folks, understandably, that ends up being too generic, too general, and we need to talk about specific psychological roles that are involved in the relationship. A lot of research focuses on the use of instruments that measure our bond with our animal companions. Usually that's an emphasis on how close we feel to them, how emotionally invested we are, maybe even to a certain degree, how safe we feel with them. What measures really don't do is talk about specific psychological roles. And I'm going to argue today that the bond that we have with animal companions is multifaceted. And it's important to keep in mind that, I'm talking about specifically dogs now, but all our animal companions have individual differences. They're not exactly the same. And those individual differences potentially, in the best of all situations, match up with the individual needs of their human companions, leading to a type of relationship that is generative and in some cases even potentially healing. So let me briefly talk about some of the psychological roles that are potentially involved. So one of the things I'll start with is the idea, especially in more contemporary psychoanalytic views, that we are human beings hardwired to make and sustain emotional attachments and bonds throughout our lifetime. In the old school way of looking at things, there was a special emphasis only on the developmental early years. But now we know that that need for attachment and connection in our lives spans the lifespan. It is very important in the developmental years. It becomes a type of platform or model in which you see the world, yourself, and expectations in a relationship, quintessential aspects of an attachment bond. But that attachment need plays out throughout our lifespan. So one way to look at a specific type of psychological role that an animal companion can play for us is they meet these basic affiliation needs. They accompany us from day to day. They are a presence in our life. You might even stretch this as far as saying that they provide a type of ontological structure. They are the people that we turn to in the morning to maybe let out, to feed, to snuggle up with in the evening. There is a structure there and a way of relating that becomes built into our very structure. And that sense of affiliation speaks to us at a very deep level. Another potential psychological role, and it moves beyond the mere presence of another to the way that that other relates with us and us with them. We can move from a type of affiliation need to a type of experience that is referenced as attunement. We feel as though this other, in this case an animal companion, is able to recognize our various emotional states and be in sync with them, respond to them in a behavioral way that registers to us as a form of empathy. The animal companion recognizes, especially when we're happy, but especially when we're distressed, animal companion recognizes, and there is research that talks about the importance of a type of left gaze bias where animal companions seem hardwired to look to the side of our faces that show this kind of unfiltered emotional expression. Well, that becomes a type of basis for recognition. And again, not all animal companions may fulfill the sequence in the exact same way, but there is a type of recognition, and when there is a type of behavioral response that we recognize as a type of attunement, that deepens our bond. It makes us feel safe. There's some specific ones that we can look at. It's not just the one where we're distressed and an animal companion seems to recognize that and comes over and is with us or licks our face or cuddles in with us. But when we think about other situations where animal companions are trained to be a type of detector for seizures, the animal companion literally recognizes the physical, behavioral manifestations, maybe even physiological manifestations such as smell, and they alert their human companion that, yes, you need to take proper steps because a seizure is coming. That's a really good example of that type of psychological in-syncness that speaks to us. Again, it's not just an accompaniment, it is a type of attunement. Another type of psychological role that is potentially present is how animal companions help those with a type of fear avoidance. And this can be filed under attunement as well. Say, for instance, you're someone who experiences a type of post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's really uncomfortable to be in rooms where there are a lot of people. The animal companion, sometimes naturally this happens, sometimes there is a training that goes with it. They can alert the human companion that they recognize the signals of the human companion being overwhelmed, and now they'll tug on them. It's time to leave this space. You're overwhelmed. That is both in a sense of attunement, but it can also provide a way to approach a type of fear avoidance that the human companion can register. Yes, they are uncomfortable. They still might utilize their connection with their animal companion to stay in what was a very uncomfortable situation, utilize resources, and be able to re-regulate their emotional wherewithal so they can stay in what was previously a very uncomfortable scenario. Another psychological role that goes, again, building on the fear avoidance, is an ability to help us increase a social network. There's such a long list of decades of research that speak to the importance of social support, and certainly the way I'm approaching this, an animal companion can be a source of that social support. They can also prompt us as a way of being a type of support to help us to go to dog parks or go to more social settings we wouldn't normally do. And there is this potential outcome of meeting other people, connecting through our dogs or other animal companions. And they subsequently help us increase the social network that we're a part of. I have just another word or two left here, but I want to speak to one more psychological purpose. And in this is one of these that statistical means may not always pick up. And there's an importance in recognizing the difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. Statistical significance at a 0.001 level that tells us the probability of these factors predicting another are very, very small. That's a very different scenario than a clinical situation where the stats may not pick up that clinical situation. And there's a type of hubris in psychology that we can measure every single thing we set out for. And yet, with the relationship, whether it's in psychotherapy or with our animal companions, it's an area that we're still learning. 100 years later, we're still learning about. So not everything we have a handle on in terms of how to measure or what exactly the variables are that are involved. With that being said, I think about my practice as a psychologist and people who have spoken to me for 25 plus years now, and part of their connection with their animal companion becomes the type of meaning or purpose in their life. If we think along the lines of more existential terms, this is the reason some people get out of bed. For some people in the extreme, it's the reason some folks continue living. That's a more difficult thing to measure, showing up in a more statistical way. But our animal companions become an existential purpose in our lives that gives us meaning to keep going. So I would like to summarize, as I'm about out of time today. The emphasis on my talk today is really to try to think about underlying psychological roles that are connected to the relationship we share with animal companions and how that potentially may parallel some of the outcome research related to psychotherapy. Relationship is significant, and I do believe over time that research is going to show that the relationship in its various facets is also quintessential between our bond and our animal companions. One of the things we often have to keep in mind too in terms of the relationship and future research and theory making is the medical model that looks at administering X number of milligrams of some type of drug. Those type of controlled environments don't really exist in social science. We try to, and good on us for trying, but we also have to keep in mind that a relationship with an animal companions have individual differences. We as human beings have individual needs, and we probably won't be able to reduce our connection into that precise type of quantification. But we can still make strides, and part of the strides would be to talk about our bond, not necessarily in a general overall sense of we feel good, we feel connected, but to talk about specific psychological roles that are involved in the potential pet effect. Thank you for your time.